Hi, you.
Suzanne,
Back to you. How long have you been in India?
I've been in India for 4 years.
What took you to India?
I was actually stuck in Australia during the pandemic, and I really didn't want to be there anymore. And my company does headhunting for various positions in midwifery, and I got a request for a clinical director. And so I put my own name in the hat in order to get out of Australia on a valid visa during COVID.
Wow.
And I had never imagined going there. I had never thought I would visit India. It was not a part of my focus, and now it's my only focus.
You're happy to be there.
I love it. It's my home now. Mhm.
Wow.
Mhm.
I wonder what it would show in your astrocartography map. It would probably show that this is the
I
place.
wondered that too. Well, I've actually studied astrocartography, and the place that aligns most with my Venus line is apparently Turin, Italy. And I went there last summer thinking, oh, maybe this is where I'm supposed to be, and it was such a no. I had to leave before the end of my plans. So, like, I should not live on my Venus line. I know that.
Yeah, well, that's true. Venus line and your work line are totally different.
I'm just so happy to connect with you. I'm so overjoyed and so grateful. My friend, you are leading us into such the area I wanted to talk about,
Yeah,
which is this work. This work is endless, and yet our bodies do not last forever. And I've always taken such guidance from you over the years. You've been such an inspiration, writing and producing. And I wonder if you have any guidance for those of us who are deep in it.
Ah, well, I think the main thing is, as I look back over my career as a loner, a lone wolf, I would say connect yourself to an organization if you possibly can, because you won't be so lonely. And also, you'll have people who can give you a lot of feedback. And then have some kind of spiritual practice so that you stay in touch with the fact that what you are doing this lifetime is just a small part of what the universe and the great mystery is all about, and that you are really important and yet not important. So it helps your ego stay in check. And it's a really good reminder. And I've begun a practice since I've stopped meditating for the last year. I haven't meditated, but I've been doing spiritual readings every morning. And it's I do that before I look at my email because it's really easy for me to get plugged into the day. So that would be my guidance, and to have a couple of close friends who you can bounce ideas off of, who are willing to give you their honest feedback. That would really help.
That's so great. I love that. Yeah, a lot of us ended up or started out alone
Yeah.
because this was such lonely work for so long. But it's different now, don't you think?
Hmm. In good and bad ways. I mean, when I look at some of the younger midwives coming up, they didn't have the passion and zeal that the midwives in the early 70s had, and the urgent need to read everything they could about obstetrical problems, to talk with veterinarians as well as any doctor that would speak to them, to get whatever wisdom they could. A lot of the young women coming up don't have that, which is really sad. Maybe that's true always of the first generation of a group of people, but I would say it's a loss,
Mm.
because that generation of midwives who are now my age, in their 80s or late 70s, they became so wise, and they learned all about homeopathy. They learned all about natural medicines. They were just unquenchable in their thirst. And I think we need that as midwives have grown in numbers, and access to midwifery has become easier, and there have been more training for midwives. I'd say it's really important for anyone who wants to be a midwife to find older, senior midwives, to listen deeply to them, to take the role of complications in birth seriously, even though most of them are caused by socioeconomic or psychological reasons. Women can still die in birth, and so can their babies. And it's a craft, it's a profession, it's a calling, and it requires a great deal of humility, along with a sense of seriousness. I have met a few very appealing, very attractive young midwives who've gotten very full of themselves and went beyond their scope of practice and didn't realize when they needed to call for help, or what they really shouldn't have attempted to handle and did, and then had babies die and almost lost a mother. And I've met some of these people who I would say have personality disorders. They have a sense of their own, of being invulnerable. And so when they get thrown out of a community for doing bad things or not getting feedback from physicians or whatever, they go to another community 3 states over and they start all over, and they tell you lies. Oh, I've been to 5,000 births. Now, this is a woman who's 30 years old. There's no way she could have been to 5,000 births. So I would say that's a very small subset, but it is really important to recognize that any profession that is at the edge of a society, which is what midwifery is going to attract some people who have personality disorders. And it's really important that we be honest with ourselves and each other, and that midwives create groups of people who will assess their records, who will meet regularly. The midwives of Santa Cruz, I'm thinking of right now, the younger midwives have dropped all of the senior midwives from their group. They no longer invite them to case studies. It's like, what? What are you doing? These are the repositories of all the knowledge of 50 years of midwifery at home. So, yeah, Manna, the midwives of North America, died. And it really didn't die, it was killed. It was killed by some very self-serving midwives who felt that they could take it over for their own purposes. And I won't even tell you who they are. I'm so appalled because Manna was a
Yeah, I think there were a lot of layers there. I think it did lose its way maybe, but I also think that it was losing its way for a whole decade. You know, I did an interview with some of the last leaders of Mana, and I think they feel like they were handed a dying organization, and so on and so forth. So I think it's been a long time coming, and
yeah.
I think a lot of people did feel like the grandmother of midwifery died. You know,
I think there's a need for birthing a new organization that is.
yeah. Well, Suzanne, you know, I've been trying to do that actually for about a decade. And the Midwifery Wisdom Collective, that hosts this podcast and conferences and workshops and online education and all the things. You know, I have not been successful, I think. And I mean, in some ways I have, but I can't find anyone who wants to carry the weight, carry the mantle, keep it going.
Which
And so I understand what happened to Manna.
Takes a lot of energy, takes a lot of time, it takes a dedication, and it takes some good people around you.
Yeah, I have extraordinary team members, but the best team members that I've worked with are not midwives,
That may be
right?
true. And that's,
Because midwives are so busy midwifing.
yeah, it's true because
Mm.
midwives so often, like midwives in partnerships, never see each other.
Yeah.
They're
If,
on call
I mean,
every
if they're doing it well, otherwise, yeah.
day. So, I would say that it's really important to bring non-midwives in. Midwifery advocates, doulas, birth educators who are radical, they need to be part of the midwife movement too, because the midwife
Definitely.
of care is something that is just now beginning to be even talked about. In the world of
Hmm.
business, the
Hmm.
term, the verb to midwife became bandied about 15 years ago. And you'd see
Hmm.
men in suits talking about midwifing an idea. And they really had no idea what midwifery was, but they'd heard that it was about not controlling, but nurturing and supporting and teasing out the very best. Well, it's gained a real foothold, but the midwife model of care has gained no foothold in hospitals. And it needs to be the model around the world, whether it's practiced by a nurse practitioner or an obstetrician or a general practitioner. The midwife model of care is a very clear, biologically appropriate model and needs to be the model that everything else is referenced to. And an example of that is the NICUs, the intensive care nursery for babies. The idea of separating an intensively needy baby, young, too small, born too soon, ill, from its mother is insane. Now, I have seen places in the world where mothers and premature babies, even tiny, tiny ones, are nursed together. And the baby is right there on the mother's body with all of the leads and oxygen and everything else hooked up to the baby as the baby is on the mother's body. And the nurses or midwives who are caring for this mother baby unit, because they are one biological system, is within a few feet of these mothers and babies. And everything done for the baby is done either on the mother's body or within a few feet where she can have her hand on the baby. So this can be done, but that's the midwife model of care. No separation.
Agreed. I literally couldn't agree anymore. When listening to you, I'm having these flashbacks of you being interviewed in that film Giving Birth, I think you produced, right?
Yeah.
I'm having flashbacks of your words in that film. I taught childbirth classes for 20 years, and that was a regular staple. And so I've heard you say that so many times that I'm having flashbacks to that great film.
Like crying in the wilderness, and
Well, I this is what I want to focus on. It's like you wrote your first book in 1973,
yeah,
and then you continued this advocacy work for, you know, half a century almost.
yeah.
And
Well,
yet,
the reason is as I went along, I began to learn more and more about the subject, more and more about what was going on with women in birth, more and more about what happened to me, more and more about my early trauma, not just in birth, but sexual abuse from my father for years, more and more about the consciousness of babies and about the mother baby system as one whole system. I became part of the Association for Pre and Perinatal Psychology movement, APA, and actually, it was started as a result of me bringing Tom Verney who wrote one of the first books about consciousness of babies, to Palo Alto, California, and then sitting around afterwards, actually in my hot tub, and talking about what he was doing. And I turned to him and I said, "You need to start an organization." And now I'm really good at telling other people what they should do. So he started the North American version of what was going on in Europe as the Association for Pre and Perinatal Psychology and Health. It is what it became known as. And I have seen that organization almost die and then come alive again with a whole generation of young women who are eagerly taking it on and who are having weekly free Zoom calls and podcasts and teach-ins from a lot of the luminaries who are in their 70s and 80s now. And I'm so excited. In the beginning, APA
Yeah.
had, it was called PANA first, but it had 500 or 600 people come from all over the world. And then the conferences got down to about 70 or 80 people. And I was so afraid it was going to die because it was so important, because it was talking about the mother baby system, and it was talking about the consciousness of babies and life in the womb and conception and things that the midwifery movement knew about innately, but didn't necessarily talk about at conferences. And to see that organization come alive again, it's very exciting for me. The big challenge is that the more we understand about the awareness and consciousness and sensitivity of babies, the more the anti-feminist, anti-abortion movement that calls themselves the right to life can take that information and use it as a reason why women shouldn't be allowed to terminate a pregnancy, which is appalling. And of course, midwifery has always, along with being herbalists, midwives have always been the ones who cared for the women who needed an abortion, who were having a miscarriage, or for the families who were experiencing a death. The midwives were the center of traditional communities. So the place for midwifery is right in the center of society. And the place for the mother baby unit, I believe, should be at the center of all political and economic and social decisions that a country makes. For example, I do not feel that any consumer product or product that is going to get to consumers like, oh, weed killer should be allowed to be on the market until it has been proven safe for the developing brain of a child. Now, doesn't that make sense?
Whew, wouldn't that be a revolution? You can almost imagine the rippling effect across society if that was the center.
And along with that, that any company that wants to create a product that goes out into the world has to do it in such a way that almost all of its ingredients are reusable or recyclable or non-toxic. And I remember reading when Switzerland, the nation of Switzerland, required consumer products, that when the people who had purchased them were done with them, or when the product was no longer any good, it would be returned to the factory that made it. And they had to figure out what to do with it. Now, so what happened as a result? Instead of a carpet having 110 toxic chemicals in it, they got it down to like 5, because it was in their economic interest, since they had the carpet back, to figure out how to dispose of it safely. So these are the kinds of things that the midwifery model of care, the midwife model of care, really brings forth. It's a vision of being in alignment with nature, of reciprocity with nature. And I don't know how many of your viewers have read the book Braiding Sweetgrass, but that's a perfect example of an indigenous tribal membered woman who's also a Western biologist, weaving together the indigenous wisdom of her people about the plant world with modern biology. And I mean, it's sold millions all over the world. It's been translated into many languages. And she's the one who's brought forth the term, it's an indigenous term, reciprocity, rather than sustainability, because reciprocity means that you give to nature before you take from nature. And that's true with how we need to approach birth, with how we need to approach a conception, with how we need to approach a pregnant, a childbearing woman, a new couple with their baby. Their needs should be at the center of all society. And that's a far cry from where we are.
It's such a far cry, and at the same time, it's very close too. I have the great pleasure of now being the the director of a new hospital that's based on the midwifery model of care. And this experience of in staff meetings and board meetings and in meeting with consulting obstetricians and anesthesiologists, ringing the bell for this mother-baby dyad in every interaction. No, when we move the mother from the cesarean bed to the bed, the baby goes with her. You know, when she goes from recovery back to her room, the baby goes with her. There's never a time when mother, baby, or father are ever separated, even if baby needs intervention, even if mother needs intervention. And it's such a paradigm shift. And yet, once it's understood, it's like such a duh. It's like such a obvious experience.
And all kinds of things change. We start cross-training nurses so that nurses
exactly
maternity care for the mother and nurses who were doing ICU care for the baby are now the same nurse doing both.
Exactly. Which is midwifery. It's midwifery. It's just high tech midwifery, But yes, it's such a profoundly obvious discovery, right? And bringing it to some of these very traditionally trained providers has been such an experience to see the aha, the light bulb, and also the fear, and then the questions that come out. And like, for instance, it is very traditional for a cesarean born baby to not only go to an isolette or a warmer, but then to be across the hospital in a different room, right? This NICU reality. And in India, all babies go to the NICU, no matter how they're born. And this is for a period of 3 to 4 hours, because this is still happening here, and sometimes longer. And so explaining that in this, because I've gotten to be at the very beginning, I actually drew out the floor plan of the hospital and figuring out what goes everywhere. And so I did not draw or build a NICU. We have NICU capacity. We have high tech, there's oxygen on the wall in every room, and we have, warmers and isolettes and pulse oximeters and NICU nurses. And like, we have the team, we have the equipment. It's just never in one place. It's wherever the mom is. And trying to explain this to the new staff has been such a fascinating experience. And the arc, and it goes so fast for some people. Like, it's like, one patient care and they're like, oh, I got it. This is actually easier. Why would we walk from one end of the hospital to the other? Why would we get a mother out of the bed and put her in a wheelchair and wheel her to another space after a cesarean? Of course, we bring the baby to her. Like, it's just like aha moment it's so obvious that once you get it, you almost are embarrassed that it's been happening another way, Exactly. And it's been profound to see this on this micro level. And I keep imagining, like, how can it become, mainstream?
Well, the breastfeeding movement, which attempted to get hospitals certified as baby friendly, was a step in the right direction, because of course all babies need to be breastfed. And if they can't be fed at the mother's breast, they can be fed by the mother's breast, on the mother's breast, with a tube with breast milk connecting from her breast and going into the baby's mouth. It can be another mother's breast milk. The country of England actually sent out a letter, their public health department, to all pediatricians in ICUs, saying that breast milk was so critically important for at-risk newborns, that anybody, any physician who did not make sure that baby got breast milk was practicing malpractice and should have a
Whoa.
license taken away. That was the
Whoa.
country of England. But of course,
Whoa.
they have public health that is controlled centrally. And so if they make a bad decision, like the decision to phase out direct entry midwifery schools in the 70s, they've reversed that now and brought them back in. Okay, so that's a bad example of what can happen when things are centralized. But it also means when things are centralized and they say every baby needs to be breastfed, then bam, that goes into action. And I can remember watching in tiny, tiny newborns in an Ethiopian hospital being gauze wrapped, because that's all they had, gauze wrapped naked to their mother's naked body. And the mothers were all circulating, standing, talking to each other, sitting down in one room with their babies on their bodies, with heaters from the corners of the room at the ceiling, throwing heat down to the mothers and babies. And that was an example of the midwife model of care. And I can remember watching a young pediatrician in this same Ethiopian Addis Ababa hospital coming in to check how breastfeeding was going with the new mom. He knelt at her bedside to be equal to her, his eyes equal in height. And it was so tender. It was so wonderful seeing what he did. That's the midwife model of care. It's respect. It's honoring, deep honoring of the process and of the vulnerability, the innate, not just resilience, but vulnerability of childbearing women and babies, such that a woman's psyche is like a sieve, a strainer. Everything you say to her goes right in. And if you say things that are disparaging, like a woman crying out in labor who's 18 years old and the nurse saying to her, well, you should have thought about this when you got pregnant, she will never forget those words. So we are dealing with the psyche, we are dealing with the physiology of the female body, we're dealing with the environment, we're dealing with so much, and we're bringing to it a very old paradigm, which is patriarchy, that has been in domination for more than 8,000 years. And it's not just control by men, it's the belief that everything that is masculine is better. And that's got to change. And it is changing, but it's very difficult because women are socialized in this system. I was socialized in this system. When I went to college, I did not have one professor who was a woman. That was 1961 to 65. Every one of my professors were men.
Wow.
Yeah. And until, I think it was about the 1970s, 95% of all obstetricians were male. And, the way they would talk to you was from a position of superiority. Which of us is the doctor? Which of us went to 4 years of medical school is what I was
Well,
told.
that's still happening. I mean, I feel like it's not just patriarchy, it's patronizing, it's infantilizing. That's still happening in a really large way. And now with the new understanding or specific understanding of the effects of obstetric violence, I think finally there's a little more attention on it, but it's still there. And like that's the segue to this work, because you've been doing this for half a century. You've been deeply involved in the midwifery model of care and advocating for the mother baby dyad. And you didn't become a midwife, correct? So what kept you going? Why do you still care so much? Because I don't even think you make money at this. You just like love everyone and tell everyone all this stuff you've learned, but like what has kept you going?
Well, first of all, there's no paid profession called social agent of change or agent of social change. So there's no money in it. But what kept me going was a combination of discovering more and more about what this period of time had meant in my life, what my birth from my mother had been like, what my mother's birth from her deaf Ukrainian 4'10" grandmother who was locked in a labor room in 1913 because there weren't enough nurses on the floor because they were mostly at the war caring for troops, and who spent the entire labor terrified and had two births in rapid succession in great fear. And after that, as a Catholic woman, aborted herself with every possible means, including coat hangers. So I knew, I found out all of this, and then I learned more about my own birth and the traumatic way in which I was born, and my mother's legs were held together because the doctor refused to come to the hospital because it was his night off, and he had told my mother, Eleanor, do not have this baby on a Tuesday. That's my poker night. And of course, I, being an Aries child, chose to start labor on a Tuesday night. And the poor labor nurse, labor and delivery nurse, she was under the constraint of not being allowed to let me be born until the doctor was in the room, or she would lose her job. Now that's another part of patriarchy. In the hospitals, you had domineering nurses controlling the nurseries. Nobody could visit, even the doctors couldn't visit the nursery. But then you had these domineering male obstetricians who were telling nurses that they would be fired if they allowed the baby to be born before the doctor arrived. So my mother's legs were held back by the nurse when every contraction during second stage, as my head is being pushed out by the uterus, which of course at that point is the strongest muscle in the body, and the baby is moving itself to try and be born, her legs were held together and her hand pushed my head back with every contraction. Now, that happened so many times in the decades from, let's say, 1915, when birth was brought into the hospital in the US, to 1945, when I was born, 44, that many of those babies ended up with severe brain damage and were in mental institutions. But it was not challenged until the 70s, until men handcuffed partners' labor bed in order not to be thrown out of the labor room.
Wow.
That was amazing. That was very creative. Of course, what the staff would do is then take her out of the bed, move her to another bed, and he'd be handcuffed back in the labor room. But it made a difference. People's activism has made a difference. And the activism now has to be about how much damage we're doing to families and the mother baby unit. And the ACE study, the
Adverse childhood events.
so critically important, even though it has not gone back to birth, it still starts at like 1 year. Adverse childhood experiences, which document that what is done to children that is either neglect or abuse, or that they see around them, has lifelong implications. So we have trauma-informed education, we have trauma-informed nursing care, but it hasn't gone into the labor and delivery unit. And we haven't to birth and pregnancy, where an awful lot of trauma occurs. And that baby in the womb is receiving all of the mother's emotions, including the toxicity of chronic fear and abuse that she's experiencing, or neglect or loneliness. So this is coming to the fore. which is really
Mhm.
wonderful, the understanding of trauma. And then you've got Gabor Mate, right?
We love Gabor Mate, don't we?
I
Oh,
mean, he is
such a
incredible.
gem.
And
Hmm.
as a physician, hooking what happened in World War II and Nazi occupation of
Hmm.
Poland uh, to lifelong trauma and the trauma of boys and men and the vulnerability of
Hmm.
boys. And the
Hmm.
light goes on, and people are beginning to understand that we are dealing with cultural trauma. We are dealing with not just familial, but intergenerational. We are dealing with the results of Native Americans and indigenous peoples all over the world being colonized and, and tortured and denied their ability as children to speak their own language and sing native songs and do rituals. We're now learning what that really has done. Now, the piece that hasn't happened yet, although the evidence is there from people like Alice Miller, the psychiatrist from um, Switzerland or Austria, who wrote For Your Own
Awesome.
Good and Thou
Hmm.
Shalt Not Be Aware, and
Hmm.
and went into studying the childhood of dictators and people
Hmm.
like Hitler. What hasn't really come to the fore is that people like Donald Trump, Putin, Kim Jong Un, I mean, all of these dictator people around the world were once babies, and they are suffering from still today severe early trauma, severe maternal attachment disorder. If you look at what
Yes.
Trump's father was like, and the fact that his mother was completely non-existent in caretaking for him, and you look at Putin and you look at Netanyahu, whose father was absolutely paranoid, and he raised a paranoid son, paranoid about Palestinians. um, we're talking about mostly men, not all men, but there are some women too, because they've been raised the same way, who are suffering from early attachment disorders. And that
Yeah.
usually occurs around birth and in the first year of life, but it can happen in the womb. It can happen when a baby is getting constant toxic hormones as it is growing in the womb. And it starts preconception. So we're beginning to understand that what happens to fathers and the sperm that the fathers are carrying in the weeks before they conceive a baby can be incredibly important because it can alter the genetic makeup of that baby. Not the
Yeah.
actual genes, but how they express themselves.
The
It's not
the
just the woman.
epigenetics. Yeah.
It's not just the ovaries and the eggs. It's now the sperm that in the weeks prior to conception, our genetic makeup can be altered such that certain genes are turned on and express themselves, and certain genes are turned off. So you can have something like schizophrenia that passes down through generations, but only shows up in a grandmother and then a great niece and then skips two generations, depending on what the environment was when the egg and the sperm were getting ready to meet up, or in utero, or at birth, or in the first months afterwards. So science is showing us why we need the midwife model of care. Isn't that?
Oh, it's so brilliant, and I just can't even imagine what's going to happen over the next 50 years of this,
So that
trying to implement this model.
this is why I stay in it. It's because it's been a
Yeah,
constant evolution of growth for me and
yeah,
understanding trauma, my family's trauma, my Ukrainian and Irish grandmother's traumas, um, and the, beginning to learn the science of epigenetics and the science of brain development. And it's like, is there anything more important? I don't think so, because this is the foundation upon which society grows, the foundation that is how that child's brain and psyche are hardwired. And we're now understanding that the human heart is made up of at least 60% neural cells, brain cells, that what the indigenous people have acted out and spoken of for eons, when asked if they're thinking, they smack their heart. They understand the heart thinks. So we're beginning to pull together modern science and ancient indigenous wisdom, which is by and large intuitive, feminine wisdom. I mean, is that not cool? What else could I be doing?
You are so cool, Suzanne. I'm so sad that we missed you in Denver. Really grateful and wanted to honor you. If people don't know, you received our second annual Midwifery Wisdom Award, which is given to someone who is not a midwife themselves, but has advocated tirelessly for the midwifery model of care. And I can't think of anyone more apt for that description. So big thank you again for that.
Well, I told you we're assistant or associate, that I'd be happy to speak at this next online conference if you want, since I was
It
unable.
would be extraordinary. We welcome you with open arms. Thank you so much. What is your current project? What are you working on right now?
Well, I finished a very long 9-part series that I didn't intend to have be long, on abortion. And this was, I started it just before Roe v. Wade. I didn't realize abortion was also my issue, although I'd had an early abortion, although my mother had had an abortion, although all the women in my family, I mean, you know, it just fired me up. And so I finished that, and I'm now back working on a 100-page piece on birth that I put aside about 4 years ago. Sometimes I put things on the back burner because I don't know what to do with them. And is it a book? Should it just go out on Button Down, which is the forum that I put things out on, instead of Substack, because they offer a lot more personal support to someone who's not very computer savvy. Anyway, so I'm working on this, and I also have a vision I am starting, and it's twofold. First is a model. It's for Boulder County, the county where I live in Boulder, which is north of Denver, Colorado, and to start a sacred circle. I've done sacred circles around the world at different conferences, but this is to start a sacred circle of people who ought to be interested in midwifery and birth and this whole period of time. And that just doesn't include midwives and birth educators and doulas and breastfeeding advocates, but it will include social workers, therapists, trauma therapists, and people who are working in schools with teenagers, especially boys, who are self-harming, because so much of what's going on with self-harm has to do with the primal period and how the brain was wired. And that feeling of helplessness that so many babies come into the world already getting in the womb, which is, it doesn't matter what I do, I won't get my needs met. And that's why among 10 to 15-year-olds, the new research shows that suicide is the highest cause of death. So I want to have them hear from midwives, but it will be a nurturing group of deep listening and support for our own personal growth and our own personal work, not a dialogue. And then every month or so, I or have someone else come and do a Zoom call, and other people can be on the calls. The sacred circle will be for women only, but the people who can be on the calls are men too. It's just that women behave differently when there are men in a group. So that's a model I want to start. I've been facilitating a call for the Alliance for Transforming the Lives of Children for almost 10 years. And it is such a rich call. And people from Australia and New Zealand and South Africa and the US, and it's made so much difference in their personal lives and their work lives. So my real big vision is that in a few years, once I get enough support to make this happen, I will create a residential training retreat on some gorgeous lake in northern Italy, which is my favorite place, for 15 to 20 women, maybe one or two infants in arms who are nursing, who are not yet crawling, who can really be cared for by the group, and 5 teachers present and 5 teachers on Zoom. And I've already selected the teachers, and it will be 6 days and 7 nights of deep connection to each other. And there will be about 20 to 60 other people, men as well as women, coming on the call, say 4 to 6 hours a day at times that are conducive to whatever time zone they're in, and be participants at that in that way. And they'll pay much less to do that. And these people will form the cadre of a community of agents of change around the world when they go back into their own communities, and have regular calls and support for what each other is doing. Because this kind of work, being a social activist, really doesn't, you can't do it alone. It's so lonely and it's so distressing. And at this training, there will be part of one day just to be doing grief work on the fact that we are grieving, those of us who are trying to make a difference, we are grieving how hard it is and how painful it is and how long we've been doing it, and nothing seems to be happening, although things are changing. So that's going to happen. And the unusual piece about it, because money is a big deal for people, is that I'm going to require that those who want to be part of this, because they will be selected from their invitations, that applications, those who want to be part of this have to create a group of 4 or more people who are supporting them financially to go to the training.
Wow, what a brilliant idea.
Because they're doing the work of going, and they need people around them who honor them to pay their way. And then they will be beholden to those people when they go home to share what they learn. And that's the beginning of their outreach community. Doesn't that sound cool?
Brilliant.
Because
totally brilliant.
So often I've been at conferences where there's just maybe half the room is conference junkies. They love conferences. They do nothing with what they learn, but they have the money to go to conferences, and so they go. Well, I don't want these activists, would-be activists, retired midwives, whatever. I don't want them to pay. They're paying with their time and their energy and their commitment.
Right.
I want them to have done the hard work of asking for help, so that
so many layers. The layers of support, folks at the wheel into the community, the retraining, how we interact. This is brilliant, Suzanne.
Well, that's where you see, I'm not meant to be a midwife. I'm not meant to sit at a labor for 36 hours. I am meant to be a visionary and to connect people. And I've met all these amazing people around the world, midwives and others, and I want their wisdom out there in the world. And I think that's where I do my best work. And my biggest challenge is I have to deal with bipolar emotional swings that I've been dealing with all my adult life. And I work with naturally and with lots of therapy and yoga and exercise and swimming, and but I can never count on how I'm going to feel at a particular time. So I have to make sure I have enough support doing this, and not just making it happen, but actually there with an assistant to help me, so that, as my friend Robin Grill said in Australia, Suzanne, you just need to be free of all responsibility except walking into the room and teaching, which I've never done. When I put on events, it's always been me doing it by, hanging on by my fingernails and pulling.
I support this paradigm shift 100%. I do 100%. And in a lot of ways, I would say that trickles into midwifery too, because I teach big business classes about running midwifery practice. And I say, actually, you get paid the big bucks to be a midwife, not an administrator, not a bookkeeper, not a biller. And actually, you need layers of support to help you do all of those things. So I'm in complete agreement. I think this is true, right? Well done, you.
Midwives need the same kind of protection and support that childbearing women and men need.
Yes. So at Midwifery Wisdom, we midwife the midwife. So I love this synchronicity and this flow. I've had such an amazing time talking to you. Where can people follow you on social media or online website? Where should we send them?
Well, first of all, I have a beautiful website with lots of information, although I haven't put the admission piece on it yet. And it's called birthingthefuture.org, Birthing the Future. And we have posters and bookmarks, and I have a lot of films. I'm going to be putting 12 of them, and I'm going to be putting them up on YouTube on a channel because we've done them on Vimeo, and it requires, they're very cheap, like $6 to be able to see it as often as you want. Nobody can figure out the directions. They are used to just pressing one button and then they get to see it. And they have to do a couple of things. So the Vimeo thing didn't work. So I have to find somebody who understands technology. It can transfer these 12 educational films, including giving birth, to a channel on YouTube.
Can I offer my team? I have an entire web and audiovisual team. Can I offer those services to you?
Can you what, hon?
Can I offer those services to you?
Yeah, I would absolutely love it because I can even raise money to pay you for doing it.
I pay them already. I have an audiovisual web team and they do all of that technical work.
Really?
And they're here in India. So I can make that happen for you, friend.
Okay. So the answer is yes, yes, yes. I'd be honored. I'd be thrilled to you do it.
Same. More people accessing your wisdom is what it's all about. Suzanne, thank you so much. I am overjoyed.
People can write me. And
yes, tell us how.
I do.
Through the website?
No, probably Suzanne Birthing at Gmail.
All right, we'll put that up in the show notes as well. Thank you.
And people can also use me in terms of one-on-one support or counseling. I offer a sliding scale, $60 to $90 an hour, and I do it by phone or Zoom, and I love talking with people. So if I can be of service to individuals or to say a group of midwives in a particular town, I'm honored. I'm not doing a lot of traveling right now because I'm 80, and much as I love to travel, it's harder on me. So, but I do travel, and it's just, I love Zoom calls because I can create an intimate space, even if it's just through an electronic visual.
One of the brilliant situations of the pandemic is we learned how to Zoom it together. Well, Suzanne, thank you so much again. This podcast will be published shortly, and I can't wait to share it with you so you can share it with your community. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Please take good care of yourself.
Thank you for all the work you're doing and for talking with me after having not just a birth last night, but an emergency to deal with just a few minutes ago.
It's my true honor. Thank you. Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye, friend. Ciao, Bella.